11 hours of bitter fighting, the battle ended with 77,000 dead and wounded men on the field. Napoleon said it was the most terrible battle he had ever fought.
Yet nothing at Borodino, except the scale, was visibly different from the limited battles between the small professional armies of the previous century. The soldiers wore the same uniforms, they carried the same weapons, they died amongst the same slaughtered horses. All that had changed was the scale, but that had changed everything.
Modern nationalism was born with the French Revolution, and it was nationalism that had changed the scale of war. When the outraged monarchies of Europe attacked the revolution, French civilians by the thousands volunteered for the army to defend the Republic. Now it was their government, their ideals, their territory that were under attack. But their enthusiasm did not survive the reality of war. As battle followed battle, with almost all of Europe at war with France, huge numbers of the inexperienced volunteers were killed, and many of the survivors lost heart and deserted. Soon the French armies were desperate for men. So in 1793, the entire population of France was mobilized for war. For the first time, a whole nation's young men were automatically conscripted into the army. The huge armies the French were now able to create soon overran much of Europe, and their enemies had to respond in kind, with national mobilization and mass armies of their own. After 20 years of war and 4 million dead, Napoleon surrendered at Waterloo and peace was restored to Europe. But the knowledge of how to organize for war on the grand scale could not be forgotten. By the mid-19th century, another kind of revolution, the Industrial Revolution, was gathering speed. The move from farm to factory, from country to city, was well underway. It gave people new ways of living and new ways to kill. Weapons were no longer made by hand. They were turned out by factories. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, men poured eagerly into the recruiting centers for both sides. Off they went to war, many of them carrying rifled muskets, new weapons that could shoot accurately 10 times as far as the muskets of Napoleon's troops.
This is the battlefield of Manassas in Virginia, where Confederate troops tore a bigger Northern army to pieces in 1862. They did it using the most modern technology and tactics, but they still thought in terms of honor and glory. Stonewall Jackson's Southerners were lined up for nearly 2 miles behind this railway embankment. With their new rifled muskets, they began picking off the Northern infantry nearly half a mile away, almost as far as those houses over there on the ridge. That gave every Southern soldier time to get off at least 10 aimed rounds, and the Northern infantry regiments were shredded as they advanced. How brave they were simply didn't matter. At the height of the attack, some Northern officer rode forward through the black powder smoke, well ahead of his troops. He headed straight for this embankment, and somehow he reached it, miraculously untouched. For a few seconds he paused here, sword in hand, as useless as he was brave. And some of the Southern soldiers just beneath him here began to yell out, "Don't kill him, don't kill him." But automatically everybody else went on firing, and within seconds he was cut down with his horse. Behind him, mostly on these slopes here, lay another 14,500 Union casualties. They had all believed that courage was still the most important thing, but the bullets didn't care.
By the early 20th century, the Civil War was long forgotten and the world was a changed place. The industrialized nations were now the wealthiest people in history. They'd learned how to invent new things and also how to produce those things cheaply and in vast quantities. They had no idea of what this might mean in war, even though they fully expected war to come. They expected war because industrialization had brought a change in the way people thought. Living in cities, going to state-run schools, reading the same newspapers, they'd become far more aware of the things that bound them together. And most of what they read and heard told them how different they were from other nations. It also told them other nations could be dangerous. Long before the war started, the industrialized nations were already living in permanent psychological readiness for it. Most of them had begun conscripting and training their young men in peacetime, even though they did not know when the war might come or why.
This used to be the officers' mess of Queen Victoria's Rifles, a regiment that went to France with the first draft of the British Expeditionary Force in 1914. Most of the men who drank the King's health in this room before leaving for France never came home again, but we have a fair idea what they expected. A short, glamorous war with plenty of scope for personal heroism, or at least a glorious and meaningful death. What they got was an impersonal, industrialized killing machine. Of the 8 million soldiers who died in the war, probably fewer than 1 in 10 ever laid eyes on the man who killed him.
When the First World War came, people almost welcomed it. It was more popular than any war ever had been or would ever be again. Most European countries immediately called up millions of trained reservists, and even in Britain, which depended on volunteers, the response was overwhelming. The army was the only place to be, and since everybody knew the war would be over by Christmas, there was no time to lose. 16-year-olds swore they were 19, and older men claimed they were under 40. I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King George V, and faithfully defend His Majesty against all enemies, so help me God. Nationalism wasn't the only reason for the enthusiasm, of course. A glorious opportunity to break away and look for adventure, is how one young man put it. It was an adventure applauded by family and friends. Everybody said, "Good lad," or "How brave you are." When they left for war, they left happy, going because they wanted to. One of the nastier surprises waiting for them was the machine gun. A friend told the American inventor Hiram Maxim, "If you want to get rich, invent a weapon that will allow the Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility." He came up with a machine that fired 600 bullets a minute, and by 1914 all the armies of Europe had it. The act of killing had been mechanized. For the first 2 months of the war, the armies tried to move and fight in the old way, and over 1 million men died. The machine guns and modern artillery filled the air with flying metal. Anybody above ground was almost certain to be hit. Eventually, the armies halted, and then something unexpected happened. They began to spread out sideways. They were simply